The gown arrived at the Ashford townhouse on the morning of the Pemberton ball, wrapped in brown paper and tied with plain cord, exactly as Miss Cecily Ward had delivered every commission for the past 3 seasons. The footman set it on the bed in the second-best guest chamber, and the Lady Dorothea Ashford, Dowager Countess of Ashford, did not look at it until she had finished her correspondence. When she did look, she pressed her lips together and said only that the embroidery at the bodice was coarser than she had specified, and that Miss Ward would do well to remember that inferior work reflected poorly on the household that employed it. Cecily Ward was not in the room when Lady Dorothea said this. She was already 3 streets away, climbing the back stair to her own rooms above the shop her father had left her, the rooms that smelled of beeswax and iron and the faint sweetness of sized silk. She did not know what the Dowager had said. She had learned, over the course of 38 months of service to the Ashford household, that it was better not to know. What she knew instead was what her needle had placed inside the hem of Lady Dorothea's newest ball gown, in stitches so small they would not be found by any eye but her own. A single line of text, worked in white thread on white linen, invisible unless a person held the fabric at exactly the right angle to the light. The words were not a poem. They were a fact. 7 words that constituted, if a solicitor were ever to take interest, something very close to evidence. She had put them there because she had no other place to put them. The evening of the Pemberton ball was cold for October, and the great rooms of Pemberton House blazed with candlelight, as if determined to argue against the season. Cecily arrived, not as a guest, but as a seamstress, summoned by Lady Dorothea's lady's maid, an hour before the family's carriage was due, to address what the maid described as a small difficulty at the left sleeve. She came with her kit and her silence and her gray gown that the room did not register as anything worth seeing. The difficulty at the sleeve was nothing. A single thread had pulled. Cecily repaired it in 4 minutes. Kneeling on the cold floor of the dressing-room, while Lady Dorothea stood above her and spoke to her maid about the Pemberton guest list, the Dowager did not look down. She had not looked at Cecily directly in 3 years. Not as one looks at a person, which is to say she had looked at Cecily's hands, at the work, at the finished product, but never at the face or the eyes or the particular quality of stillness with which Cecily moved through the Ashford household's rooms. To Lady Dorothea, she was a pair of capable hands attached to a problem to be managed. It was in the carriage hall, gathering her kit and pulling on her plain overcoat against the October air, that Cecily first saw Lord Edmund Ashford, the Earl of Ashford, her patroness's son. He stood at the far end of the hall, one hand at the frame of the outer door, his back to the room, looking at the dark street as if he were deciding whether to go out into it or return to whatever he had come from. He wore the dark navy tailcoat that she had seen on him once before, at his father's funeral 2 years ago, and he was quite still in the manner she had noticed then, the quality of stillness that was not peace but the effort not to move. She had not been close enough to see his face clearly at the funeral. She was close enough now. The horizontal scar along his left cheekbone caught the light from the carriage hall sconce, a pale, fine line that she recognized with the automatic attention of someone who worked in fine detail as old. He turned before she expected him to, and for a moment, across 12 feet of cold marble, his gray eyes passed over her. Not through her, over her. As if she were a thing that registered, a thing that occupied space and warranted the brief expenditure of attention, that actual objects warranted the same attention. A man of careful mind gives to any detail that does not fit neatly into the room's established pattern. The attention lasted perhaps 2 seconds. He said nothing. She said nothing. She picked up her kit and went out into the October street and told herself she had imagined the weight of it, the way a person who has been invisible for 3 years imagines, sometimes, that she is not. She did not imagine it. She knew she had not imagined it. She walked home in the dark and did not permit herself to think about it further. The Ashford household's commission work had come to Cecily through the back channel that governed such arrangements. A word from one housekeeper to another, a trial order of household linens, and then, slowly, the more visible commissions. Lady Dorothea's morning gowns, and then her afternoon wear, and then. Lady Dorothea was not generous with praise or payment, but she was reliable, and reliability was what kept a seamstress's shop solvent in a season when 3 other establishments on the same street had closed their doors. Cecily understood this with the precise clarity of a woman who kept her own accounts as her father had kept his. In the same ledger with the same clear figures, no optimism and no despair. To the household servants, Cecily was Miss Ward, the seamstress, which was to say she was a fixture like the chandelier or the rug in the second drawing room. She was addressed when she was needed, and not addressed otherwise. The housekeeper, Mrs. Binns, was kind to her, in the brisk way of women who have little warmth to spare, but distribute what they have equitably. The lady's maid was indifferent in the pleasant way of someone who lacks strong feeling in either direction. Lady Dorothea was polite in the manner that cost her nothing. The politeness of a woman who has never had to be unkind to a tradesperson directly when she could simply not see them. It was in this house 3 months before the Pemberton ball that Cecily had discovered the letter. She had not been looking for it. She had been looking for her thimble, which had rolled from the second drawing room into the adjacent study during a fitting. And she had followed it through the door that stood an inch ajar, and she had found it on the floor near the leg of the writing table, and she had also found, spread open on the surface of that same table, a letter in Lady Dorothea's handwriting, addressed to Mr. Bull. Gerald Poole, a solicitor she recognized as the one who had managed the later stages of her own father's estate, and she now understood, the one who had been managing the Ashford accounts in the 2 years since the late Earl's death. She had not meant to read it. She had read 1 line before the sense of it reached her. 1 line was enough. The line concerned a debt of £600 that Lady Dorothea had attributed in the letter to Cecily's father, the late Mr. Rater, Thomas Ward. It stated that Mr. Mitcheray Ward had borrowed the sum against his shop and its contents, that he had died in default, and that the debt was therefore the legal liability of the estate, which was to say of Cecily herself, the sole heir to a seamstress's shop, and the contents of 2 rooms above it. Cecily had stood for a long time with her thimble in her hand. She knew this to be false. She knew it the way she knew her own name, without having to check, because she knew her father's accounts and had kept them since she was 17 when her mother died, and it fell to her to understand what they were living on, and because the debt, had it existed, would have appeared in the ledgers he had left her. And it did not appear anywhere in those ledgers. Not in the year cited, not in any adjacent year, not in any margin or annotation. She knew it to be false because she knew the character of the man who had taught her every stitch she knew, who had kept his shop square with his creditors, and paid his debts as they came due, and died with less than he had hoped, and more than he had feared. And borrowing £600 against the seamstress's shop on Fallow Street was not a thing he would have done, and not a thing he had done. What she did not know was why Lady Dorothea had written such a letter, or what she intended to do with it, or whether she had already acted on it. She replaced the letter exactly as she had found it. She retrieved her thimble. She returned to the drawing room and finished the fitting without speaking of what she had seen, without any change in the careful, neutral expression she maintained in the Ashford household's rooms, and when she left, she walked very steadily down the back stair and out into the street, and did not allow herself to feel any of it until she was inside her own door with the bolt drawn. That evening she had opened her father's ledgers again, every one of them in order. From the first year he had kept the shop. She read every entry. She checked every figure. She found nothing. She sat at her work table with the last ledger in front of her and the candle burning low, and she understood with perfect clarity that what she had read was not a mistake. It was a fabrication, and a careful one, and it had been written to a solicitor who had the means to act on it. She wrote to her father's original solicitor, the older man on Crandall Street who had drawn up the shop's deed papers in the first place, a man who had known her father and respected him, and she waited 3 weeks for the reply that confirmed what she already knew. There was no such debt. There had never been any such debt. There was no record of any transaction between her father and any creditor affiliated with the Ashford household or its accounts. She did not confront Lady Dorothea. She was 24 years old, and her income depended on the Ashford commission, and she had no proof that would survive a drawing-room conversation. Only the memory of a letter she had read in 5 seconds in a room she had not been invited into, and the absence of a debt in her own records, and the word of an elderly solicitor in a letter. What she had was the truth. What she did not yet have was the means to make it matter. What she did instead was stitch the fact of it into a hem. If it sounds strange, a woman's private archive written in thread on the inside of a petticoat, consider what else was available to her. She could not publish a notice in the papers. She could not depose before a magistrate without the original document and a witness, and the kind of legal standing that a tradesperson's daughter did not possess in the ordinary run of things. She could not speak the accusation aloud without losing the commission that fed her. What she could do was preserve the record of what she knew in the place where she worked. In the medium, she commanded absolutely where no one but herself would think to look, because no one but herself cared what was stitched inside a hem. In white thread on white linen, across a strip of fabric cut from her own workroom stock, Lady Dorothea's name, the sum, the date, and 4 words from the letter itself, in the form she had memorized from the single line she had read. 7 words in a hand so small they would not be visible to a casual eye. She put them there on a Tuesday evening in late July, with the window open to the summer air and the shop quiet below, and the sound of the street coming up faint and ordinary. She told herself it was for herself only. A record for her own keeping. Insurance against forgetting. A private monument to the fact that she had seen what she had seen, placed in the one location where no one would look for it, and she would always know where to find it. Edmund Ashford had been back at the townhouse for 6 weeks, returned from his father's affairs in the north, with his father's debts and his father's title and his father's habit of entering rooms as if he had not yet decided whether to stay in them. He had not intended to attend the Pemberton ball. He had been persuaded by his mother's solicitor that his absence from the season would be read as insolvency. And while he did not care especially what the season read, he cared about the practicalities that insolvency produced. He went. He stood near walls. He spoke when spoken to and listened to more than he answered, and watched his mother arrange his evening as she had arranged his morning since he was 12 years old, with the quiet, authoritative efficiency of a woman who has been managing this particular household for 30 years and sees no reason to stop. Lady Honoria Dalton was presented to him twice during the Pemberton ball, once by his mother and once by Honoria's mother, who managed the introduction from a slightly different angle, as if a second perspective might produce a different result. Lady Honoria was perfectly beautiful, in the way of very young women who have been told since infancy that they are beautiful and have arranged themselves accordingly around that fact, so that the beauty and the performance of it have become indistinguishable. She smiled at him with the practiced warmth of a woman auditioning for a role she had been told was hers, by virtue of correctly checking every box the role required. Edmund watched her and felt nothing that interested him. It was the woman at the far end of the gallery, the one in the gray gown who had come to mend his mother's sleeve, and was now crossing toward the servants' entrance with her kit at her side, who had registered. He was speaking to Pemberton's eldest son about something he was not attending to closely, and he tracked her movement across the edge of his vision, the gray gown among the colored ones, the unhurried pace of someone who knows where she is going and requires no escort to get there. He did not know why she registered. She was not beautiful in any obvious prepared sense. She was slight and plainly dressed, and moved with the specific economy of someone who has learned to take up as little space as possible in rooms that were not designed for her. She had looked at him in the carriage hall with direct eyes that were not performing anything, not curiosity, and not deference, and not any of the careful calculations he was accustomed to reading in a room. And in a room full of performance, this had the weight of a stone dropped into still water. The specific weight of a thing that lands where it lands and continues to register after the surface has settled. He asked his mother's lady's maid who the woman was. The maid told him. Miss Ward, The seamstress. The woman who did all the commissioned work for the household. Very capable, the maid said, with the faint condescension of one servant assessing another from a particular angle of social proximity. Very quiet. Has the shop on Follow Street, left to her by her father when he died the year before last. Edmund nodded, and went to find a glass of wine, and thought about the directness of those eyes for longer than the subject warranted. He called at the Follow Street shop 10 days later, on a pretext. The pretext was that his own coat needed a lining replaced, which was true, and that a recommendation from his mother's household made this the establishment of choice. He was shown in by a girl of perhaps 15, who appeared to be the sole assistant, a quiet, round-faced girl who took his name and disappeared, and he was left in a small front room hung with samples of fabric and labeled rolls, the kind of room that was organized with the specific tidiness of a person who cannot afford to waste anything. He read the names on the fabric cards and looked at the small framed illustrations on the wall, showing current modes of dress, the kind of thing kept for reference, not for decoration, and waited. She came in from the back, and she saw him, and she stopped for a half-second before she continued. He said, "Miss Ward." He said it, because she had not said anything and one of them had to, and he had called on her, and it was his pretext, to manage. She said, "My lord." She said it with the neutrality of a woman who has practiced the particular art of not telegraphing surprise, of receiving whatever the room presents with the same contained expression, regardless of what the room presents. Her hands were at her sides. On the right one, he could see the small stain of ink at the index finger, the kind that came from marking fabric with a transferring pencil, and did not wash out entirely, regardless of how often one washed one's hands. He asked about the coat. She looked at it, assessed the lining with the quick efficiency of someone who is never looking at the wrong thing, and told him what it would require, and how long it would take, and what it would cost. She did not speak more than the work demanded. She was taking measurements when necessary, and making notes in the small commission book she kept on the side table, and she looked at him when looking was required by the task and not otherwise, and it occurred to him, standing in the small orderly room with the smell of beeswax and warmth from the back room's fire, that she was the only person he had been in a room with in 6 weeks who was not trying to give him something or take something from him. "You have been with my mother's household some years," he said. 3 seasons, she said, making a note. She speaks well of the work. She looked at him, then briefly over the top of her commission book, and what he saw in her face was something complicated, a flicker of something that was not quite agreement and not quite its opposite. "I am glad to hear it," she said, and the words were correct in every form. The voice that said them told him almost nothing except that she was not glad in the uncomplicated way the words suggested, that there was something else in that sentence that she had chosen not to name. He left the shop with no better information than he had arrived with, which was to say, not much information at all, but with the persistent sense that Miss Ward was carrying something she had not put down, and that it was heavy, and that she was accustomed to the weight. The second occasion was not arranged on a pretext. His mother had arranged a small dinner, 12 covers at the long table in the first drawing room, the guest list composed with her usual precision. Lady Honoria on Edmund's right, and Honoria's mother across from her and several of his mother's friends, arranged to ensure the conversation moved where Lady Dorothy intended it to move. Edmund ate and listened and answered what was asked, and was as present as he knew how to be, which was present enough to discharge his obligations without being present enough to encourage anything he was not prepared to encourage. Miss Ward arrived at 8:30 to deliver a commission for the widow. Lady Crewe, who required her police, returned before she left for Bath. Cecily was shown to the hall by Mrs. Binns and waited with the wrapped garment across her arm, while the housekeeper went to inform Lady Crewe. The dinner party was audible from where she stood, the voices carrying their comfortable cadence through the closed door, the sound of a room in which everyone belongs and knows it. She heard what Lady Dorothea said to Lady Crewe's daughter in the small anteroom adjacent to the hall, in the 10 seconds during which Lady Dorothea did not know anyone outside the party was within earshot. The door to the anteroom was ajar, and Cecily was standing 2 yards from it, and the voices were distinct. "She has been serviceable," Lady Dorothea said, "for a tradesperson's daughter with pretensions above her station." Cecily stood with the pelisse across her arm and did not move. "Lady Crewe's daughter," said Miss Ward. "I have found her work perfectly satisfactory." "Satisfactory," Lady Dorothea said with the particular calibration that transformed the word into its opposite. "Yes, if one is prepared to overlook the matter of the debt her father left when he died. £600, you know. Against the shop rather leaves one in an awkward position regarding the family." Lady Crewe's daughter made a sound of sympathetic uncertainty, and the conversation moved on, and Cecily stood in the hall with the specific cold of a person who has just heard a lie repeated in front of witnesses as established fact. Not proposed, stated. The debt her father left, as if it were known, as if it had been confirmed. She delivered the police to Lady Crewe. She thanked Mrs. Binns. She went home in the October dark, and she opened her father's ledger to the page she knew by heart, and she sat at her work table and looked at the figures until her eyes adjusted to the candlelight, and the figures were perfectly clear, as they had always been, with no debt of £600 in any year, of any column. In the morning, she wrote to the Crandall Street solicitor again, this time asking specifically about any contact between the Ashford household's Mr. Poole and her father's estate in the year before and after his death. She asked him to put his reply in writing and to be as particular as he could manage. Edmund found the letter 3 weeks after the dinner. He was in his father's study, which he had been avoiding in the manner of a man who knows a room, contains things he is not ready to look at, working through the steward's files in search of a deed that the steward had misfiled under the wrong county, and he found the deed, and he also found in the same leather folder a copy of a letter to Mr. Brontercont.
Pull.
He read it once. He read it again. He put it down on the writing table and stood looking at it. It named a debt of £600 against the estate of one Thomas Ward, tradesman, of Fallow Street. It named a creditor. The Ward family would not have known to dispute, one that operated through Poole's office. It named a date 3 months before the man's death, a date on which, as Edmund recognized from adjacent correspondence in the same folder, the Ashford household had been managing certain financial arrangements it preferred not to be managed publicly. The letter was in his mother's handwriting. He sat with it for some time. He sent for his father's original solicitor, not Poole, the older man his father had employed before the household economies of the past 2 years had replaced old and trusted arrangements with cheaper ones. He sent the note by his own hand and asked for a private meeting, without mentioning the letter or its subject. The reply came in 4 days, and what the older solicitor told him in the quiet of his office on Crandall Street accounted for 3 separate communications with Poole regarding the Ward estate. Communications he had declined to formalize, communications that had then been taken to Poole regardless. Edmund thanked him, folded the letter from his father's folder into his breast pocket, and went home. He went to his mother's study that night, after the household had gone to bed, and he confirmed that the original letter was still in its place in the correspondence drawer. He did not take it. He noted where it was. His mother was in the morning room when he came down the next day. She was writing correspondence at the small desk by the window, the same hand, the same angle. She looked up when he entered and said with mild impatience, "You are interrupting." "Yes," he said, and closed the door behind him. She recognized something in his face. She put down her pen. He told her he had seen it and what it contained, and he told her he had spoken to the Crandall Street solicitor, and he told her he knew about the letters to Poole and what they had been intended to accomplish, and he used the word fabricated in a level voice that gave her nothing to argue against on the grounds of his agitation. Because he was not agitated, he was simply clear. Lady Dorothea was not a woman who lost her composure, in an obvious sense. She had been managing the Ashford household's difficulties for 30 years, which meant she had been managing them through 2 periods of financial strain, and 1 period of public scandal, and 1 period of her husband's long and expensive decline. And she had done it with the self-possession of a woman who believes that composure is itself a form of authority. She said the debt had been a legitimate claim, poorly documented. She said she had acted in the household's interest in a difficult season. She said the Ward woman's shop had been operating under the benefit of the Ashford Commission for 3 years, and had profited accordingly. He said, "You have been telling people she is responsible for a debt that does not exist." She said, "I have been protecting my position by destroying hers." There was a silence. Outside the window, the street was gray and ordinary. Lady Dorothea looked at her son with the expression of a woman who is recalculating the room's configuration. She picked up her pen. "She is a tradesperson's daughter," she said. "She has no position to destroy." He left before he said something that could not be recalled. He was very careful about that. He had learned the value of careful speech from the same woman, which was one of the less comfortable ironies of the situation. That afternoon he sent a note to Fallow Street, not through the household channel, but by his own footman, addressed to Miss Ward personally. He asked, in the correct form, if she would be available to speak with him on a matter regarding the Ashford household's accounts. He named a day and a time and requested a reply. She replied the same afternoon in the small, clear hand that he had seen in the commission book, and she said she would be available, and she signed it C. Ward. He was shown into the front room of the Fallow Street shop on a Wednesday morning, and she came in from the back, and they stood on either side of the table with the fabric samples. And she looked at him with the direct eyes, and waited for him to say what he had come to say. He told her about the copy of the letter, and that he had seen the original, and that he had confirmed through his father's solicitor that the debt was not real. He told her that the letters had been fabricated. She said after a moment, "You know about it," he said. "I have seen the copy." "You know about it as well," she said. "I read the original by accident, in your mother's study 3 months ago. I was looking for my thimble." Something in him settled. The specific way that confirmation settles what suspicion has been holding open. He said, "I am sorry." She looked at him. "It is not your apology to make, my lord." "No," he said, "but it wants making, regardless." He told her the debt did not exist, that he had confirmed it, and that the letters to Poole had been intended to establish grounds for a claim against her shop that he did not intend to allow. She was very still. Then she said, she was going to claim the debt against the shop. "Yes? I believe the intention was to present it as settled fact at the point when my mother wished to terminate the commission without disputing the accounts." A silence. She was looking past him for a moment, at some private reckoning that he was not party to. And then she came back. She said, "I stitched the fact of it into the hem of her newest ball gown." He said nothing because he had not expected this. She said, her voice quite even, 7 words. I had no other place to put them. There was no one to tell, and I could not let myself forget what I had read. So I put them in white thread on white linen inside the hem at the quarter mark, where no one would look unless they were looking for them. She paused. She has been wearing the gown since August. She does not know they are there. He looked at her for a long moment, and she looked back, and what he saw in her face was not the performance of composure, but the real thing. The composure that comes from being alone with a difficult fact for a long time and having no one to hand it to. He said, "Show me." She went to the back room and came back with a length of white linen, narrow cut, from her own workroom stock, and she held it at the right angle to the winter light from the window, tilting it slightly so the thread caught. The stitches were invisible until the angle was precise, and then they were clear, small, and exact, and unmistakable. He read them once. He straightened. "I need to bring this to my father's solicitor," he said. "Along with the original letter, the linen is the only independent record I have," she said. "The original letter is still in your mother's study. She may have removed it." "Not yet," he said. "I looked this morning, before I sent the note." She looked at him with an expression that shifted almost imperceptibly, the shift of a person who has been braced for the door to remain shut, and finds that it has opened. "You looked this morning," she said. "Before I sent the note," he repeated. "I wanted to confirm the evidence still existed before I asked you to speak with me. I did not want to ask you to trust me without being certain I had something to offer in return." The room was quiet. Snow had begun outside, the fine early kind, and it fell on the gray stones beyond the window without sound. She was holding the linen in her hands, and she looked at him, and then she said, "I have my father's ledgers." And a letter from my father's original solicitor from Crandall Street. Bring them, he said. Both. He paused. You have been alone with this? Yes, she said. I should have found it sooner. She said, you did not know. I notice now that I should have noticed sooner. The accounts are my responsibility. I have not been attending to them as I ought. She was quiet for a moment, with her father's ledgers waiting in the back room and the linen in her hands, and she said at last, When do you want to meet with the solicitor? The meeting took place on a Thursday in the Crandall Street offices, and Edmund was present, and so was the older solicitor, and so was Cecily, with her father's ledgers and her own letter, and a very correct and formal bearing that gave nothing away to anyone watching. The original letter from Lady Dorothea's study was laid on the table. The solicitor reviewed it, and the ledgers, and the prior correspondence, and he asked his questions with the careful patience of a man who has seen a great many documents and knows which ones matter. At the end of an hour, he said what Cecily had known he would say. The debt as constituted could not be enforced. The letters presented questions of a serious nature. He used the word fraud in the quiet, weighted way of a man who does not use it loosely. Edmund said there would be no formal proceedings. The solicitor regarded him. Edmund said, Miss Ward's commission with the Ashford household will be placed on a written contractual footing, at a rate I will specify for a period of not less than 5 years. Any outstanding dispute regarding her father's estate will be resolved in her favor in writing by Mr. Poole before the end of the week. I will see to it personally. The solicitor said that was a resolution of considerable generosity. Edmund said, It is a resolution of accuracy. Miss Ward is owed what she is owed. He looked at her when he said it. She was across the table with her hands folded in her lap, and her father's ledgers stacked at her elbow, and her face carefully maintained in the expression she used in professional rooms, and she looked back at him, and he saw in her face the same thing he had seen in the carriage hall of Pemberton House, the thing that was not performing anything. He said for the record, Miss Ward has come by her father's shop honestly, and has run it with exactness and integrity for 2 years. She has also been of considerable service to my family. It is time that service was properly acknowledged. She said nothing then. She looked at the table, and something in her face that had been held precisely in place for 3 months moved slightly, and was still again. After the solicitor had gathered his papers and they were alone in the anteroom, she said, You did not have to arrange it that way. I know, he said. You could have corrected the record with Poole directly. I could have. She looked at him. She was 24 years old, with ink on her right index finger and her father's ledgers tucked under her arm, and she had carried a secret in a hem for 3 months, and stood in a solicitor's office and not wavered, and he had come and read what she had stitched, and come to find her. And none of this had been engineered by anything except the particular quality of his attention in the carriage hall, and the particular quality of her eyes when they met it. He said, I would like to call on you again, Miss Ward. Not on household business. She said, That would be somewhat irregular. He said, Yes. She considered this. She said, I am a tradesperson's daughter. He said, You are your father's daughter. I read his shop ledgers before I sent you the note. He kept his accounts the way my father's steward should have kept his accounts, and could not. You learned it from him. She said, You read my father's ledgers. I needed to understand what I was looking at, he said. A pause. Something in her face that was the very early precursor of a different expression, the arrangement of a face that has forgotten, briefly, that it was suppressing itself. She said, Yes. You may call again, my lord. The visit to Lady Dorothea was brief. Edmund did not ask his mother to apologize. He told her what had been arranged with the solicitor, and with Poole and the terms of the commission contract, and he told her he expected her behavior to reflect the new arrangement. Lady Dorothea received this with the composure of a woman who has understood that the room has changed and is engaged in her own private recalculation. She said, You are not yourself, Edmund. He said, I am entirely myself. She pressed her lips together. She did not mention Miss Ward by name, but she understood about Miss Ward from the fact that Edmund had arranged the matter personally, which was not a thing he did for household commissions. She returned to her correspondence, and he left the room, and the subject between them was put away, in the manner of matters that are not resolved so much as settled, because one person with the authority to settle them has decided how things will be. Lady Honoria Dalton's mother redirected her daughter's campaign to more promising ground before December, with the efficiency of a general who understands when a position has been outflanked and does not waste time lamenting it. The first time Edmund used Cecily's given name, they were in the back room of the Fallow Street shop on a grey afternoon in November, and she was showing him the new hem she was setting, a commission for Lady Crewe's daughter, and she held the linen at the window to show him the stitch quality. And he had come to stand beside her to see it better, and was closer than either of them had noticed. He said, "Cecily, not Miss Ward." Her name, in his voice low and without preface, as if he had been saving it for the moment there was room for it. She turned her head and found him nearer than she expected, and the winter light was pale and flat, and there was nothing in the room to account for what was in the air between them, except 3 months of a secret he had come to read, and the specific quality of his attention in every room he had been in with her since the carriage hall. He said, "I have been finding household pretexts to come here every 3 days. I have run out of household pretexts." She said, "I know." He said, "I am asking whether that is agreeable to you." She put the linen on the work table and turned to face him, and she said, "I stitched a secret into a hem, because I had no one to tell it to. I kept it there for 3 months. She looked at him. "You came and read it." He said, "I will always come and read it." She looked at him for a long moment. She said, "That is a considerable promise." He said, "Yes." She said, "I am inclined to hold you to it." The announcement was made at a small gathering at the Ashford townhouse in January, which Edmund had arranged, and which was attended by the Crandall Street solicitor and Mrs. T. Binns and Lady Crewe, who had always found Miss Ward's work perfectly satisfactory, and a handful of the older members of his father's acquaintance who needed to hear it said and confirmed before the season's machinery could form its own interpretation. Lady Dorothea was present in the sapphire gown, because Edmund had told her she was expected, and she had come. Edmund stood in the center of the room with Cecily beside him in the pale blue gown she had made herself, the first gown she had made for herself in 3 years, and he made the announcement in the plain, direct way he did most things. 12 words. "Miss Ward has done me the honor of accepting my proposal." The room was quiet for a moment. Mrs. Binns pressed her lips together in the manner of a woman managing an expression too visible for the occasion. Lady Crewe nodded once, with the air of a woman whose judgment has been confirmed. The solicitor made a note. Lady Dorothea sat near the fireplace with her fan at her chest and received the information with the composure she had been building since December, since the morning Edmund had come to her and told her how things were going to be. Cecily stood in the pale blue gown and did not look at the room. She looked at him. That evening, after the gathering had dispersed and the house had gone quiet, she sat in the back room of the Fallow Street shop with the lit candle and the commission work that still wanted doing. The hem for Lady Crewe's daughter, the last commission of the year, the needle moving in the familiar rhythm that had been hers for as long as she could remember. The linen strip from Lady Dorothea's ball gown was in her hands. She had unpicked it that afternoon. The thread had come out cleanly, as good thread does when the work that placed it was done with care, and she held the 7 words in her hand for a moment, the loose white thread that had been her archive and her monument, and the only witness to what she knew. Then she set it aside. She did not need it any more. The record had been read. It had been read by the only person she had needed to read it, and that was enough, and more than she had imagined in July, when she had stitched it into the hem, with the window open and the summer air coming in and the city going on without her in the ordinary way. There is a particular quality of winter evening in that part of England, when the light goes early and the fire in the workroom grate has settled to a steady orange, and the street beyond the window is quiet. The smell is beeswax and warm wool. Outside, snow fell on the stones of Fallow Street, the fine, slow kind that accumulated without sound, covering the worn step at the front door and the unpainted shutters and the sill of the workroom window in a layer. So even it looked like something deliberate, something arranged. Edmund knocked at the back door at 7, as she had known he would. She let him in. "Wed." The cold came in with him for a moment, and then the room was warm again. And he looked at her in the candlelight, and she looked back with the eyes he had first seen in the carriage hall of Pemberton House, direct and unperforming. The eyes that had registered him, she had told him once, because he was the only person in that hall who had looked at her as if she were standing somewhere and not disappearing into it. He said, "What are you working on?" She said, "Lady Crewe's daughter, the hem wants resetting." He pulled the chair to the other side of the work table and sat, and she took up the needle, and the fire was steady, and the snow fell on Fallow Street, and she stitched in the candlelight, and the 7 words that had lived in a hem for 3 months were dissolved back into white thread and gone, and she did not need them any more. She had found someone to tell. If this story stayed with you, leave a word in the comments about the moment you knew. Thank you for being here until the end.